Okay. All right, well, good morning. My name is Lieutenant Brown, and this is RTR case 17-00008. So what I'm going to do first is just make sure that our chairman has a chance to start. I'm taking over. I apologize. Yes, go ahead.
I noticed. Thank you. So it is the 25th of April at 10:40 in the morning. The Response to Resistance Review Board is now in session. And I'm going to introduce myself, introduce the other members of the board so you know who's talking to you. So I'm Tom Hackney. I'm the Director of Personnel and Professional Standards. I'm also the Chair of the RTR Board. And I'll start at my very far left and let everybody introduce themselves.
Lieutenant Felipe Alicia.
Assistant Chief Lolita Smith.
As you've already heard, Lieutenant Brown. I'm over the Professional Oversight Unit.
And Assistant Chief Jackson Short.
There are other people that you see here off to my right who aren't board members, but the General Counsel's office is here, the Police Academy is here, and they act as references to us if need be, and we'll seek their input here later. As the person to my right quickly jumped the gun, he is the floor leader of this Response to Resistance Board, so at this point in time I will turn it over to him to read some things to you and ask you some questions.
Yes, the first thing I'm going to do is confirm that you filled out the certain forms that we need you to fill out. So Officer McGee, the Bill of Rights form, you've filled that out, completed that, and understand those. Is that correct? And so in the Bill of Rights form, it indicates that you have the right to have a representative with you, which you have elected to have today, correct? It also indicates that you have the right to review all the case file, all the documents associated with this case. You've had a chance to look at those as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The other form that both of you signed was the Administrative Proceeding Rights form that talks about your obligation to truthfully testify and answer any questions that we have for you. Have you both signed that form?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And then the final form is the sworn statement affidavit, and that simply is just acknowledging that the statements you give today, because this is an official proceeding, are under oath. You signed that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now, in connection with that form, I'll have you raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Okay. At this point, I'm going to read a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to read is the confidentiality notice. This case is going to be open even after this hearing concludes. The case will only be closed if the sheriff decides that there is nothing further to be done, or if there is something else to be looked into by the Internal Affairs Unit, it will only be considered concluded when they have given a disposition to the case. So with that being said, based on the current state of law, these proceedings are considered confidential and are not subject to disclosure until they become public record. Therefore, anyone participating in these proceedings is prohibited from willfully disclosing any information obtained during this process, including the nature of the questions asked, any information revealed, or documents furnished in connection with these proceedings until they become public record. So basically, until the case is closed, you can't discuss the case, you can't discuss anything we've talked about here today with anybody outside of your representative, okay? All right. I'm also going to read the purpose of the RTR Review Board. Now, these hearings are done and then they are placed online so that the public can see the review that we do anytime our officers discharge their firearm at an individual. So the Response to Resistance Review Board conducts administrative reviews of incidents involving certain uses of force by members of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. These reviews are conducted to ensure adherence to agency policy and training. Consistent with state and federal law, the Sheriff's Office affords substantial deference for the instantaneous judgment and decision-making that must be used by law enforcement officers in certain situations. However, this deference does not permit any member to depart from agency policy, training, or professional standards of reasonableness. And so since the ability to use force is such an extraordinary license given to law enforcement officers, the public looks to the Sheriff's Office to monitor and regulate these uses of force. At today's hearing, this board will assess the appropriateness of the actions of all involved members based upon the facts and circumstances known to each member at the time of his or her decision to use force. So today we're looking at the decision to use deadly force by Officer McGee. We obviously have a witness officer that will provide some testimony. But at the end of this hearing, that is exclusively what we're looking at. That's the scope of this particular hearing. And I'll turn this over to the chairman for our rule of exclusion.
So at this point in time, since we have a witness officer, I will invoke the rule of exclusion. So the involved officer will be able to stay with their counsel, and the witness will need to step out, and we'll call you back in when it's time. So we'll do that now.
Officer McGee, we'll have you stand by with your representative. Because you can see everything that has to do with this case and any of the documents or records, you'll be able to sit in here while the criminal detective goes through the investigation that he conducted. So that being said, Detective, you should state your name, ID number, in your current assignment, and your assignment, responsibility on the night of this incident.
Yes, sir. My name is Glenn Workentine. I'm currently, my ID is 7461, currently assigned to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, and we responded out because to the officer involved incident. I was the lead investigator at the scene.
The lead investigator of this officer involved shooting. And with that being said, you have a presentation that you've prepared. You're ready to go through that now?
Yes, sir.
All right, sir, if you could take us through that.
Yes, sir. This officer involved incident occurred on Wednesday, 4/26/2017 at 01:05 hours. It's in the morning. Officer involved with Officer R.L. McGee, ID 72561. At the time, he was assigned to Patrol Zone 1, Watch 5, Gold Squad. His date of employment was 4/1/2013. On 4/26/2017 at 19:49 hours, Officer McGee wrote a domestic battery report documented under CCR number 1727713 for Miss Hall Dingle. She was going by Hall at the time, and she was married, well, by Dingle, but she was married to Mr. Selwyn Hall at the time. Ms. Hall Dingle against her husband, Selwyn Hall, who was not on scene at the time of that report. Officer McGee closed out the report stating that he would seek an arrest warrant for the suspect for the battery and violating an injunction for protection against domestic violence. Later in the evening, between 0036 and 0057, Mr. Hall returned to the residence, at which time Mrs. Hall called the police and said that the suspect returned. Officer McGee responded back to the residence with Officer Hodges. Hurley, clarify that at the time of this incident, Officer Hodges went by that name, and since then, her name has been changed. She now goes by Officer Hurley.
So how are you going to refer to this officer throughout your presentation?
Throughout the presentation, I will refer to her as Officer Hodges because it occurred at that time. I want to stay consistent with what happened that evening and who she was at that time.
Okay, and so by doing that, and it makes perfect sense, the board will just have to transition because we want to refer to her by her current name, so we'll transition and we'll be calling her Officer Hurley. But
Yes.
Hodges and Hurley are the same person.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Hall was contacted in the front yard of the residence and resisted the officers' efforts to arrest him but became combative. During the struggle to arrest him, both officers deployed their respective CEWs, which is a conducted electrical weapon, which were ineffective on Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall then grabbed Officer McGee's CEW during the struggle, at which time Officer McGee transitioned to his issued Glock 17 and fatally shot Mr. Hall. Timeline of events. I've got his first couple calls were these calls were from the complainant. The first one, she had actually gone down to the neighbor's house, and the neighbor actually made this call that transition gave her the cell phone so that dispatcher could talk to her. That's on 4/25/2017 at 19:47, 37 hours. This is that 22 report that he responded to, and that CCR I gave you at the beginning.
Jacksonville 911, what's the location of your emergency?
It's at Liberty and 19th Street. What's the address? The lady said it's an emergency. I'm a neighbor. She said her husband's jumping on her.
Okay. Is she there with you now?
Yeah, she's out right here in front of the house.
Am I able to talk to her?
Police location.
Okay, yes, ma'am. This is Rivera with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office on the recorded line. What's going on out there?
My husband has jumped on me.
Okay.
I got an injunction on him, a permanent injunction. And he's telling me about what he gonna do to me if I call the police. He just took my stuff out the house and just dragging it out and just taking my stuff.
Is he white, black, or Hispanic?
Sir,
Is he white, black, or Hispanic?
he's black.
What color shirt, what color pants is he wearing?
He got on a green shirt.
Can you see what color pants he had on? Ma'am?
He got on a green shirt.
Okay, what color pants does he have on?
Black.
Black pants. Okay, what's your last name?
Yes, sir. Can you have him, please? Can you have him, please?
Yes, ma'am.
He
Do
just jumped
you have a
on me.
good phone number to reach at? Have you reached that?
I don't have a phone. He can bust my phone up.
All right, we'll get somebody out to see you, okay, ma'am? If anything else changes, give us a call back, all right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Please, sir.
Has anybody been drinking, doing any drugs, have any weapons on them?
Then at 4/26/2017 at 003431 hours, 911 call from the complainant. The complainant said police told her to call back if her husband returned to her house.
Jackson 911, what's the location of your emergency?
I'm at. The policeman told me to call him back if my husband wants to come back. He had bruised me.
Okay. And your husband's back there now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. What's your last name, ma'am? Okay, and a good phone number for you, ma'am.
Ma'am, sir?
What's a good phone number for you?
Yes, it is.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get somebody out there, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Well, same date at 005747 hours, 911 call came from the complainant again from 332 East 19th Street. Complainant said her husband just pulled up and was parked in the yard.
Jackson 911, what's the location of your emergency?
Yes, I'm at street. I just called, and the police came, so he done pulled back up in the yard. He's sitting outside parked in the yard.
The officers already came out there and left?
Yeah, but he done came back. The boy, my husband, he's outside in the yard parked. Can you tell him to hurry up?
Yes, ma'am. I'll go ahead and have him come back out there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Now, these following transmissions are actually radio transmissions from HQ, checking on the officers, and it progresses quickly throughout. So 10327 HQ checking if Bravo 258, which was Officer McGee, is 1077. 1077 basically if the situation's under control.
Bravo 258, checking 77, Mike Ski.
Then at 10333, Officer Hodges responds and said he is 1077. Whenever reviewing this, letting them review the case file, I had put Officer Hodges that replied back that was clarified to me that it was Officer McGee that replied. It was actually Officer Hodges that replied saying that he was 1077.
Bravo 258, 77.
Then at 10436, come back, shots fired. Then at 10443, put out 1033, which is emergency traffic for Bravo 350. Officer Hodges is put out by dispatch.
1033, Bravo 350, 22. Office 796, Street 1030.
Before we go any further, whose transmission was the shots fired transmission?
The shots fired, that would have been Officer Hodges.
Okay, thank you.
Then at 10530, Bravo 350 advises 1077 start rescue 1068, which is acute distress, one in custody with multiple gunshots. Bravo 350 is actually Officer Hodges.
Bravo 350, 77, start rescue, 1068, one in custody, multiple gunshot wounds.
This is a diagram that I received from the crime scene unit depicting the evidence they collected outside the residence and where the incident occurred. I wanted to depict this. That's the actual one. Then I've actually got another one kind of blows up a little bit so you can see a little better as far as the items. This is the diagram. It said evidence 1 is a black slipper. 2 and 3 are wads of CEW wire and a CEW cartridge. Item 4 is a fragment or unknown projectile. 5 and 6 are CEW green cartridge doors. 7 is a black zipper, the left black zipper. Slipper. Evidence 8 is a CEW green cartridge door, and 9 is also a green cartridge door with some aphid tags. Aphid tags are what, whenever you discharge your taser, it's little round, almost like chads that come out and help identify the identification purposes of that taser. Number 10 is a pair of glasses. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, so basically all these in red were shell casings, 9mm shell casings, and 18 was a CEW cartridge. And 20 was a wad of CEW wire there. This photo, they're just showing basically the evidence, the placards showing the evidence that I just went over in the diagram. Again, same thing. Actually, BS1 there, bullet strike 1, is actually a strike that the ET found and photographed. Over the fragment there, number 4 is from that strike on the side of the vehicle. Come around to the front of the vehicle again, the items, the placards, 7, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And 10 is the glasses. 20 was a CEW wire, and 7 is that left black slipper. These following photos are just using for presentation purposes for the officers as far as perspectives, overall view of the residence, then actual a front view of the residence as you're looking at it from the street, and kind of moving in closer, approach to the suspect's vehicle, that yard. Again, a closer view of where the suspect was actually found, located within the vehicle there. Again, another perspective for the officers for their testimony. Another one there, and this one here basically is showing during the daylight the scene with what the placards look like, where all the evidence was located.
What's the gray box that's on those pictures?
The gray box, that's actually when these crime scene photos actually had the suspect in the photos. So put the gray box there just to redact that out to keep the body out of the presentation. Okay. Our subject involved was Selwyn Aubrey Hall, black male, date of birth 5/20/1959. He was 57 years of age. His criminal history had 23 felony charges, 4 felony convictions, none of them were violent, 32 misdemeanor charges with 12 misdemeanor convictions. Medical examiner's office autopsy on Mr. Hall, it was documented under MEO number 17-0834 by Dr. Gillespie. Toxicology was done. He was positive for cocaine and blood
So
alcohol.
I'm sorry, I interrupt. He had cocaine in his system.
Yes, sir.
And it couldn't be confused with any sort of legal prescription drug.
No, sir. The blood alcohol content 0.096. His cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds, and a manner of death was homicide. Weapon inventory of Officer McGee's weapon. He utilized his Glock Model 17 serial number. Had 1 round in the chamber, 9 live rounds in the magazine, and 8 shots have been fired. State Attorney's Office letter. This letter is to advise you that our review of the death investigation of Selwyn Hall is now complete. After full review by our officer-involved incident team, we have concluded that the death of Selwyn Hall was justified under applicable Florida law. We'll be providing a detailed report of our review to you in the near future. We're notifying you of our legal opinion now, though, so that you can take any internal or administrative actions that may be necessary.
Detective, in the call from the complainant, the female mentions that she got an injunction. She obtained an injunction against this suspect. Can you walk us through what that means? What is an injunction, and what generally needs to be demonstrated for an injunction to be obtained?
What had happened back in, this injunction was actually taken out as a permanent injunction for 2015. What usually occurs if you're involved in a domestic-related violence type incident, the officer will come out, do a report, list that person as a victim, have a suspect, and it is instructed upon that victim to go to the state attorney's office, seek an injunction for protection against the suspect or who that suspect may be.
And so the demonstration by the petitioner, the person seeking it, is that the suspect or the respondent has committed violent acts and is a violent risk to that person. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so this was an injunction against that person, prohibiting him from coming anywhere near the petitioner, correct?
That's correct. There are some other stipulations as far as that.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Lieutenant Alicia?
No questions.
Assistant Chief Smith?
No questions.
Assistant Chief Short?
No questions.
Director Hackman?
You've alluded to it in a couple different ways, but as you first talked about it, CEW, conducted electrical weapon, that's commonly known as a...
Taser.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Not any further.
Thank you, Detective. Actually, stand by in case we need clarification on any details.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it. So now we're going to call Officer Hurley. Good morning, officer. State your name, ID number, your current assignment, and the assignment that you had on the night of the incident.
Good morning, Officer Hurley, 74025. I'm assigned to Zone 1 Gold Patrol now, and I was on the night of the incident as well.
Okay, officer, with respect to your involvement to this case, from the dispatching of this call to your arrival on scene with Officer McGee and in anything that happened, just from your perspective, please walk us through everything that happened. And I want to be sure to emphasize, don't add any details that you may have learned subsequent to all this, but really walk us through your perspective and the information that you had available to you as you were going through this incident, okay, or your response to this incident.
And pull that microphone just a tad closer to you, if you will.
Before I begin, if I could please have the evidence technician diagram placed on the screen. Okay. On 4/26/2017 at 00:48 hours, I was dispatched in reference to a domestic dispute. Prior to my arrival, I was informed by the primary officer, Officer McGee, that he had probable cause to arrest the suspect in reference to a domestic battery that occurred earlier in the day. We arrived on scene and spoke with the victim, who told us that the suspect had already left. She gave us a few areas where we might locate the suspect and also said that he was driving a silver SUV with a paper tag. Officer McGee and I left the residence to bolo those areas for the suspect. While we were en route, we were informed by HQ that the victim had called back and said that the suspect had returned to the residence. At which time Officer McGee and I then returned to the residence. Upon arrival, we parked our vehicles farther down the street. Can't really see it on the screen. It was farther down than this, and approached the residence on foot using the roadway. Officer McGee approached the vehicle and positioned himself in approximately this position. I approached the vehicle and positioned myself in approximately this position. Officer McGee made contact with the suspect, told him that he was under arrest, and asked him to step out of the vehicle. The suspect did not comply, and Officer McGee reached in to grab the suspect. As soon as I observed Officer McGee go hands-on with the suspect, I ran around the back side of the vehicle and up the driver's side to assist. When I came up the driver's side of the vehicle, the suspect was no longer in the driver's seat. He was outside of the vehicle and fighting with Officer McGee. He struck Officer McGee in the chest and the neck area. I moved in and tried to grab the suspect's arm, which he ripped from my grasp, and in return tried to grab onto my arms. Officer McGee executed a leg sweep, which was ineffective because the suspect was able to grab the chain link fence right next to the vehicle and hold his weight up. Officer McGee and I communicated that we needed to remove the suspect from the small area between the driver's side of the vehicle and the fence so that we could better engage with the suspect. I then ran around the back side of the vehicle and came up towards the front of the hood to approximately this location. When I came up towards the front of the vehicle, I observed the suspect with his body facing towards the driver's door, and he had both of his hands on top of the vehicle. This was the most compliant that he had been at any time during the encounter. I unholstered my handcuffs and placed a handcuff on the suspect's wrist that was closest to me. As soon as the handcuff was attached to the suspect, he immediately began to actively resist again by tensing and pulling away from me. He also ripped his grasp from Officer McGee. Officer McGee and I were then able to pull the suspect from between the vehicle and the fence towards a more open area in front of the vehicle in approximately this location. I started to deliver multiple knee strikes to the suspect's lower groin and abdomen area while trying to maintain control of the hand, which was already handcuffed. I saw Officer McGee delivering multiple strikes to the suspect's upper torso and head area. The suspect was able to violently shift his weight. None of our strikes were effective. And after shifting his weight, he was able to break free from both of our grasps and position himself in approximately this location next to the residence. His back was facing the residence, and he was facing both Officer McGee and I. His body was bladed and his fists were clenched. Officer McGee gave the suspect verbal commands to stop resisting and to get on the ground. The suspect did not comply, and Officer McGee deployed his taser. The suspect swiped at the probes and the wires, and the tase was ineffective. I then deployed my taser, and the suspect continued the same behavior, swiping at the probes and pulling at the wires. It appeared as if there was a probe attachment or a probe attached to the lower portion of the suspect's body. I moved in to drive stun the suspect in the upper portion of his shoulder. As soon as my taser made contact with the suspect's shoulder, he immediately grabbed on my arms and attempted to rip the taser from my grasp. While I was fighting with the suspect for control over my taser, I was able to twist my body weight from him and move to approximately this location on the diagram, where I attempted to reload my taser and call for backup on the radio. As I was turning around to face the suspect, because after jerking away from him, my back was briefly turned, I could hear Officer McGee say, "He's got a taser, he's got a taser." I then observed the suspect standing at approximately this location with his back facing the vehicle. He had a taser in his hand, his arm was outstretched. The firing end was pointed in the direction of Officer McGee. The light at the end of the taser was illuminated, indicating that it was on. I observed the suspect take a step in the direction of Officer McGee and heard multiple gunshots come from my right. I observed the suspect fall on the ground and heard Officer McGee communicate to me to move in to finish cuffing the suspect, which I did. After the suspect was cuffed, both Officer McGee and I rolled the suspect over to assess his injuries. I called for rescue on the radio and additional units to respond. Both Officer McGee and I provided aid until I was removed from the scene by Officer Barnes, and that concludes my involvement in this incident.
Okay. Let's start back with the establishment of probable cause for the suspect, with the charge being it was domestic battery.
Yes, sir. I believe it was domestic battery and in violation of an injunction.
So when you arrived on the scene, what discussion or what communication did you have with Officer McGee as to the charges and what any sort of plan of action would be if you encountered the suspect?
Officer McGee and I discussed that he did have probable cause to arrest the suspect. We have worked on hundreds of calls together, many of them responding to domestic violence related calls together. From working with Officer McGee, I knew that he would take the primary lead in contacting the suspect verbally if we were to encounter him, because he was the primary officer, which is what I expected to occur. So just from working together, I knew how to approach the suspect with Officer McGee, how to approach the vehicle with Officer McGee from our experience together.
And so you were positioned, when you approached the vehicle, you were on the passenger side, he was on the driver's side, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And just to clarify, they've already been said, but the suspect was initially in the driver's seat of the driver's side of the vehicle.
Yes, sir.
And so the plan that you discussed or worked out was a result of calls that you worked on before, but then there was some sort of discussion about why you could take this person into custody, but also any sort of history that that existed with the suspect, not just from that incident. Was there any previous encounters that you had or Officer McGee had that he discussed with you with the suspect, bringing other knowledge about the suspect into this incident?
No, sir. The only incident that was discussed was the earlier domestic battery.
All right. During the fight, and he's obviously was resisting quite actively and violently, there were a number of physical maneuvers that were used, a number of strikes. Did you ever consider backing away in the area where you're in between the fence and the vehicle and transitioning to the CEW that early? Any consideration given to that at all?
I did not consider that, no, sir.
Okay. Did you consider it after he moved right in front of the vehicle, immediately after he moved in front of the vehicle where you had more room?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And how long before you pulled out your taser, how long were you there in front of the vehicle with the suspect?
It happened very quickly, so I can only say possibly seconds.
Okay. But at some point you transitioned to your taser first, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You deployed your taser. It didn't have any effect on the suspect. And later on, you're hearing Officer McGee yell out that the suspect has a taser. And so it's very clear that the taser he has, because you were trying to reload a cartridge on yours, was Officer McGee's taser, correct?
Correct.
And when you saw the taser was pointed out, the suspect was pointing it in the direction of Officer McGee, you said you could see the light on, it was clearly pointing. I don't know anything about the illumination and how clear things were. Could you see if there was a cartridge on the end of the taser?
I could not tell if there was a cartridge or if blast doors were attached to the end of the taser.
Okay. When you turned around, and if you could just show me using the laser pointer,
Yes, sir.
your position when you turned around while you're witnessing the suspect pointing the taser at Officer McGee, where exactly are you standing?
I'm standing in this area here, and the suspect was standing in approximately this area.
And Officer McGee was where?
I did not visually see Officer
Okay.
McGee. I just know that he was to my right because that's where I heard the gunshots come from.
So you couldn't see him. Is that because he was behind you in a way? He was outside of your peripheral? Is that what I'm understanding?
I was focused on the suspect at that time.
Because my next question was going to be, when it came to the discharge of his firearm, were you able to see, if there was, what was behind the suspect as he, fired shots? You obviously knew when he fired shots because you were hearing them, but could you see what sort of backdrop or anything beyond the suspect other than the vehicle? Were you able to see, what he would have been looking at all? Just trying to get an idea of where, what you were seeing just from your perspective to see. Before we interview Officer McGee, I'd just like to know, all of the visual information that you had access to there, seeing Officer McGee, both right up to and including the shooting. What were you seeing, and from potential backdrop to anything that the suspect was doing other than just holding out the taser?
At the time the shots were fired, the only thing that I observed was the suspect standing with his back to the passenger side of the vehicle.
Okay.
That's what I was focused on.
I have no further questions. Lieutenant Alicia.
So when the initial contact with the suspect was made on the driver's side, Officer McGee made that contact, you came around to assist, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Recognizing the constrained location that you were fighting, you disengaged and moved to the other side, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you placed that handcuff on the suspect, did you kept control of that handcuff the entire time, or as much as you could to try to pull them and handcuff them, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I got no other questions.
Assistant Chief Smith.
You mentioned you were fighting the suspect. You and Officer McGee were fighting the suspect. I know you mentioned where you struck the suspect. Where did he actually strike you?
I don't recall.
Were you injured?
I had a slight injury on my forearm, and I do not recall when I received that.
Okay. Now, just for clarification, in one report, you mentioned you handcuffed the left, and you mentioned you handcuffed the right arm of the suspect. Although that's not the biggest thing going, it's just on record that your intent, you handcuffed the arm that was the closest to you, or the hand, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Assistant Chief Short.
Sure. You mentioned a couple of times that the suspect was actively resisting, and I might have missed it, but can you describe a little bit in greater detail what that means? Was he striking you, kicking, biting?
Yes, sir. His body was tensed. He was pulling away. He was also striking with his forearms and attempting to grab onto both Officer McGee and I as well. At times, he would use his body to try to push us away from gaining any physical control of him. His fists were clenched, and he continued to brace his weight and actively shift his weight away from us.
Okay. Have you received any training at the police academy or anywhere else about the dangers of a suspect with a handcuff?
Yes, sir.
Can Can you explain that?
A suspect with a handcuff can cause significant bodily injury. He could use it as a weapon to swing. It's a heavy metal object. He can, if it's open, he can use it to stab in any location on somebody's body.
Did you have any other less lethal options available to you immediately?
I did have OC spray that was available to me.
Do you understand the difference between OC spray and a conducted electrical weapon, what they're designed to do?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain that briefly?
The taser is designed for two things. It can be used as pain compliance or neuromuscular incapacitation, and the OC is pain compliance.
Okay, so of those options, which one was the most appropriate?
Neuromuscular incapacitation.
Okay, and then lastly, in hindsight, do you think it would have been better to disengage the suspect to de-escalate the situation?
No, I do not.
Why not?
The suspect was violent. It was clear he did not have an intent to flee or to stop being violent. He was a threat to both myself, Officer McGee, and the victim who was present in the residence at the time of the incident.
Okay.
And the suspect needed to be detained.
And what type of crime is it to batter a law enforcement officer?
It is aggravated or it's a felony crime.
Okay, thank you.
Director Hackney.
All my questions were answered. I don't have any questions.
Okay. Also, we're going to have you leave the room, as again, you're just a witness. After Officer McGee's testimony, we'll have what's called the executive session. We'll bring you back in for that, so you can witness that. And if we have any additional questions, we'll ask you at that time. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Officer McGee. Morning, sir. State your name, ID number for the record, as well as your current assignment and your assignment on the evening of this incident.
Good morning. My name is Officer Ryan McGee, and I am currently assigned to Zone 1 Patrol Gold, and I'm on Watch 5.
Okay. So what I need you to do now is walk us through all of the details of your response to this incident and everything that happened during, again, keeping just to the details that you were privy to at that time, and nothing that you've learned subsequent to that, okay?
Yes, sir.
And if you wouldn't mind, for context, walking us briefly through that initial incident where you had conducted an investigation and realized that you had probable cause for domestic battery, and the details that you learned there with regards to the actions of this suspect, including any alleged violent actions.
Yes, sir. Before I'm going to refer to Officer Hurley as Officer Hurley during this. I know there's some confusion.
Yes, Officer Hurley.
Officer Hurley. I hope that's okay.
Yes.
Good morning. So today I'll be testifying to the incident that occurred on April 26th, 2017, officer-involved incident. On April 25th of 2017, at approximately 1949, as dispatched, refers to a domestic battery incident. During this, I established probable cause to arrest the suspect for domestic battery. The victim had described to me that the suspect had dragged her from her porch and dragged her around the front yard by her hair. I observed injuries consistent with what the victim had told me. The victim also provided me with a copy of the injunction that she had against the subject for domestic battery, and it was a permanent injunction as well. I verified this in NCIC and everything was checked out. The victim had also provided me with a description of the clothing that the suspect was wearing as well as the car he was driving. She'd also mentioned that he had been drinking heavily throughout the day and that he was intoxicated. On April 26, 2017, around 0048, I was dispatched for a second time to the residence in reference to the suspect returning. When Officer Hurley and I arrived, we spoke with the victim. However, the suspect was no longer there. She provided us with a couple locations that he might be, and we canvassed the area for them to see if we could find him, but ultimately we couldn't. About 10 minutes later at 0058, we responded back to the residence for a third time. When we approached the residence, I could see the suspect's vehicle parked in the driveway, as you see here in the diagram.
What prompted your response back on that third time?
She had called 911 again, as we saw in the slides before, and said that the suspect had returned. She was fearful that he was going to continue to cause harm to her. As we approached, as Officer Hurley mentioned, we had approached from down here, walking a little bit further, but we approached on foot. I observed the suspect's vehicle in the driveway, and I observed him sitting in the driver's seat of the vehicle. I could see the cell phone glow, and I could identify him as the suspect. I made contact with the suspect as I walked up, and I could make contact with him about right here as he's still sitting inside the vehicle. I informed him that he was under arrest and to step outside of the vehicle. He immediately refused. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, gripping it extremely tightly. I then realized that I would have to forcibly remove the suspect from the vehicle. Knowing this, I placed my hand on the suspect to attempt to remove him from the vehicle. However, it is very difficult given the amount of resistance that he was giving me by gripping the steering wheel as hard as he could, trying to pull his body back inside. I was able to remove the suspect from the vehicle, and I could see Officer Hurley making her way around to the front of the vehicle from where she was positioned to about right here to try and assist me. By the time she got there, I had the suspect outside of the vehicle, and I was able to get the driver's side door closed. I continued to fight with the suspect as Officer Hurley moved in to approach to try and help me. Be mindful that this all occurred in a very small confined area of about 2.5 to 3 feet between the driver's side of the vehicle and then the small chain link fence here. So I'm continuing to fight with the suspect, and he is also fighting back with us. He is grabbing the chain link fence that you see here, bracing himself against it, refusing to allow us to place him in handcuffs. During this time, Officer Hurley is able to place a handcuff on one of the suspect's wrists. He continues to fight violently with us and is able to break our grasp from him. I separate from the suspect now on this side of the suspect, effectively placing him between Officer Hurley and I. Officer Hurley was still on this side. I remove my taser from the holster and I point at the suspect and I say to him, "Put your hands behind your back or you're going to be tased." The suspect immediately said, "You are going to have to kill me." I then responded to him, "I don't want to do that. Please just put your hands behind your back." The suspect then placed his hands on top of the vehicle as if he was going to comply. Realizing this is as a potential surrender position, I holstered my taser and I moved in to try and place handcuffs on the suspect and end all of this. As soon as I placed my hands on the suspect, he began to resist violently again. Again, he was throwing his arms and now he's trying to hit us with his fists. Be mindful that he now has a handcuff attached to his wrist. We continue to fight and to wrestle the suspect against his vehicle out of this confined small area to the front of the vehicle here. At this point, I can see the suspect begin punching Officer Hurley with a closed fist and a handcuff still attached to his wrist. Officer Hurley is yelling at the suspect to stop resisting and to get on the ground while she's kneeing the suspect wherever she can. I'm behind the suspect at this point as we have just moved from here, and I'm behind him trying to force him to the ground while also trying to punch him to gain some compliance. Again, the suspect refuses all of this, and none of our non-lethal techniques at this point have been successful in gaining compliance. Once again, the suspect's able to break our grasp, and he lands with his back against the residence about here. At this point, I unholster my taser again, or CEW, and I deploy the suspect for one cycle. About 2 to 3 seconds into the cycle, I can see that it's not having an effect on the suspect. I then hear Officer Hurley deploy her taser on the suspect as well, to which I can see has no effect either. During that, the suspect, I see, grabs his hand and removes a taser prong from his shoulder, again saying, "You are going to have to kill me." Split seconds later, he is charging directly at me, while I still have my taser extended in my hand, pointed at him. When he's charging at me, I'm positioned about here, and he charges directly at me, and I'm able to deflect the suspect, effectively putting him with his back against the passenger side of the vehicle here. We continue to fight violently with this suspect as he is still punching us, not only trying to get away, but trying to fight us now. I use my taser in a drive stun mode to try and gain some type of pain compliance from the suspect. I can see Officer Hurley is doing the same thing as well, none of which, again, are having any effect on the suspect and seem to be only making him more angry. During this violent and dangerous fight, the suspect is able to gain control of the taser, and I immediately yell out, "He's got a taser." I can see the white flashlight from the taser pointed directly at Officer Hurley, as she is on now the right side of the suspect. I can see the flashlight shining off of her uniform and off of the insignia that she has on her uniform as well. Mindful that this is occurring in the midnight hours and it's in a dimly lit area, usually by minimal street lighting. So based on the fact that the suspect has he's made the decision to continue this violent, dangerous fight over a course of minutes despite multiple opportunities to comply. The severity of the crimes that he has now committed on police, including aggravated battery on law enforcement, aggravated assault on law enforcement, and now resisting with violence. All taking into account the fact that the suspect now has a possession of 2 known weapons, including a functional taser and a metal handcuff, I perceive him to be a deadly threat to myself and to Officer Hurley. It is my fear that the suspect would use the taser and the metal handcuff in a way that could incapacitate us and cause great bodily harm. This is all coupled with the fact that the suspect has about a 40-pound weight advantage on both of us. We've attempted numerous non-lethal techniques to try and gain compliance, arrest, and subdue the suspect. At this point, again, I perceive the suspect to be a deadly threat, and I realize that deadly force is necessary and reasonable to stop the threat. At this point, I made the decision to step back and unholster my firearm. As I'm doing so, I can see Officer Hurley disengage from the suspect. As she had mentioned, she is positioned about here. All this is occurring in a matter of seconds. As soon as Officer Hurley disengages from the suspect charges directly at me with the taser in his hand and the handcuff on his wrist. I'm able to remain on target with the suspect charging at me while being aware of my arc of fire, my backstop, which includes now a large metal SUV, and Officer Hurley's safe position away from any firing that would be done. Taking all this into account, and the suspect was still charging at me, I fear for the life of myself and the life of Officer Hurley, and I begin firing at the suspect. I stop firing once the suspect hits the ground. Once this is done, I have Officer Hurley move forward once it's safe to place handcuffs on the suspect. Once handcuffs are placed on the suspect, I holster my firearm and I roll over the suspect to try and assess his injuries and try and render some aid to him. By this time, Officer Hurley is called for rescue on the radio, and responding officers are arriving on scene to assist us. Responding officers arrived on scene and removed me from the scene, and I have no further involvement in this case. Thank you.
Okay, on your initial call when you responded, did you look into the suspect history?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and we obviously know because of the detective's testimony here today that he had dozens of charges and then a number of convictions. Is that what you saw when you researched him? When finding something like that out, what does that do anything to your awareness with regards to officer safety?
Yes, sir. Of course, anytime that there's someone who has a violent history, it's something that I always take into account when I would, one, have to seek an arrest warrant or hopefully go back and arrest someone to do that.
Okay. And so when you did respond back for the third time, and we know that the suspect had returned because the complainant called back in and said he was there, what discussion did you have with Officer Hodges at the time, Officer Hurley, with regards to how you would approach the suspect or take him into custody if he was encountered?
As Officer Hurley has mentioned, and I'll mention as well, that we've been to hundreds, if not thousands, of calls together, including dealing with violent individuals, traffic stops, domestic incidents, things like that. So over the number of years that we've worked together, we developed situational plans according to this. Specifically for this incident, I had informed her of the criminal history of the suspect and also the fact that I had probable cause to arrest the suspect.
Okay. Now, you mentioned when you approached the suspect, you said that he was under arrest. Was there any statements that you made before that in an attempt to perhaps approach him with a little more of a less tense manner?
I did not. Those are the statements I made at the time.
Okay. Looking back on this incident, with the benefit of hindsight here, as far as approaching somebody that you know you're going to arrest, would you have considered there to be maybe a different course of action just with regards to your dialogue to him at all?
I can't go back and change this, obviously, but in the future, it's something that maybe I could take into account. Yes, sir.
Just to perhaps de-escalate or prevent a situation from escalating. I want to be clear. Obviously, your probable cause was based upon an incident that had just occurred hours before, in which you had the reasonable belief that this person had committed a violent act. But nevertheless, without him immediately demonstrating an act of violence towards you, obviously it could potentially have started things differently if you had spoke to him in a different manner. It may not have had zero effect whatsoever.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so when you grabbed hold of him, you guys exited the vehicle and you were able to shut the door. You mentioned there's about 2.5 feet right there between the fence and the vehicle. Though numerous strikes were being delivered while you were grappling with him, you couldn't pull your CEW out. But once you disengaged, you mentioned you pulled your taser or your CEW out. Why did you not deploy it then?
At that point, I had try to attempt to give the suspect some type of warning to place hands behind his back before the taser was deployed.
And he did so, correct?
Yes, sir. And at that point, he complied to what I believed was successful compliance from him.
Right. And as Officer Hurley described, that was the most compliant he had been throughout the whole incident. So
Yes,
at that
sir.
point, that is when you holstered and she applied that handcuff on the one wrist, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you walk me through how you perceive after he ended up pulling away and he's got a handcuff on one wrist and he's got the open-ended handcuff in the other, how you perceive that to be a deadly threat?
Yes, sir. As that is, if somebody strikes you with something like that, it could be taken as being stabbed. I've also been shown pictures throughout the academy through my training of people who have received injuries from an open handcuff being used to slash, and there's been multiple stitches or open wounds that have caused because of that. It's actually a very dangerous object in itself.
So that weapon alone you considered to be a deadly weapon or potentially deadly weapon?
Yes, sir.
If he used it in a certain manner?
Yes, sir.
After he took your CEW, you mentioned before that you had transitioned to use it in touch stun mode, which is obviously there's no cartridge in the end because you already used one cartridge, and that's a pain compliance option. But then when he took your taser, was there another cartridge that was attached to the end of the taser so that he could use it in the actual probe deployment mode?
I had not reloaded my taser.
Okay. So where was that second cartridge at?
It was in my cartridge pouch.
Okay. And so the obvious question is, if he's pointing a taser or CEW at anybody, but he doesn't have a cartridge on the end of it, or at least to your knowledge, at the time he didn't have a cartridge or access to a cartridge, why would that be considered deadly force?
At that point, it can still be used in a touchstone mode to go through clothing, something like that. Also, with that being said, there were still wires that I didn't know it maybe come off them or not come off them. That could be wrapped or entangled in myself that could incapacitate me as well.
How far away was he from you?
At what point, sir?
At the point that he was pointing the CEW.
At that point, it appears on this diagram that it's 8 feet. From the night of the incidents, it felt like maybe 3 or 4 feet. And again, he was charging at me with that, and it's extended in his hand, so very close.
Okay. So we've already gone down the road of the handcuff and how that could be considered a deadly weapon. But we have a taser, we have a CEW where there is no cartridge on the end of it, and we've already established that the only way that could be a threat is through a pain compliance type situation if he only had the CEW. But just explain to me a little more about what you're talking about when it comes to the wires being tangled up, et cetera.
If the wires could be tangled up against him, it could be then tangled against me. I didn't know because we were still engaged in this violent fight with the suspect after I had already deployed my taser against him. The fact that I had now already drawn my firearm at the suspect as well, having that out and immediately available could incapacitate me to the point where he could retrieve that and unfortunately do harm to both of us with that.
And in the probe deployment mode, it's more than pain compliance, as you obviously experienced in the academy. Were you tasered in the academy?
Yes, sir.
How long of a deployment did you receive in the academy?
It is 1 cycle, which is 5 seconds.
5 seconds. And for that 5 seconds, were you able to do anything at all?
No, sir.
You mentioned your backstop was the SUV, and we obviously know that outside of the engine block, it's not necessarily considered the most concrete of a backstop, but were you aware of anything else in the background? Were you conscious of that when you fired your weapon?
Again, this occurred in a matter of split seconds, it seems like, during the incident. I was aware of Officer Hurley's safe position away from me to where anything that would be done would be out of the range of her being involved in that. I do remember being about where the suspect is here, in between here. So you would be correct in saying it's not in front of the engine block. However, it's a better backstop than, it's the best backstop I could have at the time with the threat constantly approaching me.
Did all of your rounds go where you intended for them to go?
Yes, they did.
Okay. So you intentionally fired each of those shots. There were no unintentional discharges.
I intended to fire every round, yes, sir.
Okay. And your weapon did malfunction at any point in time.
It did not.
Okay. I have no further questions. Lieutenant Alicia?
So during the course of this struggle, have you been trained with regards to grappling, wrestling, or a non-compliant individual?
Yes, sir, I have.
Have you taken additional training prior to this incident with regards to grappling or wrestling with a suspect?
Yes, sir. I received the standard training through the academy. However, after that, I decided to seek training on my own to further perfect and further work on my training as well. So I had martial arts training prior to this, and dealing with non-compliant individuals through my job, I'd gained experience. I continue to do it now as well.
So you would say that your skill set with regards to your grappling, you were comfortable and confident while you were grappling with this individual, and he was still able to thwart all of your abilities to apprehend him or to put him into custody?
Yes, he was. I feel confident in my abilities. However, he was still able to defeat them. Yes.
Okay. No further questions.
No
I'm
questions.
sorry. And then Assistant Chief Short.
Sure. Did you have any other less lethal options immediately available to you?
I did. Yes, sir.
What were those?
They would be my OC spray.
Okay. Do you understand the difference between OC spray and the CEW and how they work?
Yes, sir, I do.
Can you explain that?
The CEW can be used in two modes: the touchstone, which is the drive stun mode to gain pain compliance, as well as when the probes do deploy and are successful upon a subject gaining complete neuromuscular incapacitation. And OC spray itself is just pain compliance.
Okay. So what would be the better option for a suspect that's fighting you?
Someone who's fighting me as violently as this person was, it would be a CEW.
Okay. When you were taught how to use the CEW at the police academy, and you were taught what happens when a suspect takes that CEW from you, what did the academy instructors tell you to do? What would be a proper response to that?
Transition to a more lethal force.
Okay. So your academy instructors told you that a proper response would be lethal force
Yes, sir.
for somebody that takes your CEW?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that after your partner handcuffed the suspect that y'all rendered aid. Can you describe that?
I rolled this once he was handcuffed. He was placed face down, and we rolled the suspect over to assess the wounds that I had now deployed the shots against him. I pulled his shirt up to try and see where his wounds were, to see what kind of aid I could, and just from what I could do is just apply pressure at that point.
So you applied direct pressure to the wound in order to stop the bleeding?
Yes, sir, but that was very brief until I was relieved by a responding officer.
Right. Did those responding officers continue that
I
first?
advised them to, yes, sir. I don't know if they actually did. So.
Okay. And then lastly, in hindsight, you think it would have been more appropriate to disengage the suspect and try to de-escalate the situation and wait on more officers?
At this point, sir, no. We were engaged in such a violent fight with the suspect that I was also in fear of the victim who was inside the residence of the suspect returning in there and causing further harm if we were to disengage.
Thank you.
Okay. Director Hatton.
So when you were doing your research on the suspect, did you see a propensity towards others with violence in looking at his background?
To be honest with you, I can't remember his exact criminal history at this time.
Okay. And you were aware, obviously, that the victim was at the scene when the shooting occurred, correct?
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. So to furtherance of your testimony, I mean, there was another person there, if you will, who obviously he had some intent to hurt at some point in time because she had a valid court-ordered injunction on him.
Yes, sir.
When you first went up to the car, was it running or was it off?
I don't remember.
Okay. To further some of the testimony you gave to Lieutenant Brown's questioning, when he had the taser and you knew there were wires there or not wires there, did he also still have that handcuff on?
Yes, sir, he did.
So the feelings that you may have felt about that handcuff being a dangerous weapon hadn't dissipated or anything. They had just, I guess, become greater because now he had that and something else?
Yes, sir. The fact that he had now had two known weapons increased his threat level in my mind. Yes, sir.
Okay. And after you discharged your firearm, where was the victim? Where did she go? Because you can hear her in the background of some of the radio transmissions. Where was she and what was happening with her?
From my memory, she was inside the residence during this, and then once she heard the shooting, she came outside.
Okay. I don't have any further questions for you. I do need it on record, though. Detective Workentine, can you at least grab a microphone or something to where we can see? A follow-up question that I have for you is, were there any forensic testing done on the taser?
Yes, sir. What we did, we took both tasers and submitted them to FDLE for DNA testing due to the fact that for their testimony that the suspect had taken their tasers. So we submitted that. We'd gotten samples from both officers, submitted all that, along with a known sample from the suspect, submitted everything to FDLE. We got the results back that their DNA, both officers' DNA along with the suspect DNA was actually on both tasers. So we had a combination of all three known DNA samples that we had taken were on each taser.
Okay. So the suspect's DNA was on both officers involved tasers?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Follow-up. Assistant Chief Short.
Yeah, Director, in addition to the active physical resistance, the suspect also had pretty significant verbal resistance, specifically telling the officers that they were going to have to kill him. I don't remember whether or not Officer Hodges was asked that or answered that. So without putting those words in her mouth, I think it would be appropriate to call her and ask her if she heard any verbal resistance.
Yeah, I agree. So if I can get y'all to leapfrog back over there.
And just for the record, there's no further questions at the moment for Officer McGee? No? Okay. Officer Hurley, you're being brought back in for additional questioning, and so I'm going to pass to Assistant Chief Short, who has another question to ask.
Sure, there was some pretty significant verbal resistance from the suspect that Officer McGee was able to testify to. Do you remember hearing any of the statements that the suspect made?
I do not. The only statement I heard the suspect made was earlier in the altercation where he kept yelling, "I left, I left." But that is the only verbal communication I remember from the suspect.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, just to clarify here. So during this struggle, from the moment that Officer McGee made contact with the suspect to the very end, you didn't hear the suspect make any sort of statements or yell or do anything like that at all?
No, sir.
Okay, all right. Okay. Any other questions for Officer Hurley?
None.
Okay. No. So are there any additional questions for Officer McGee? And so if not, we'll transition to our executive session. So you can actually stay in here if you just take one of those seats in the back, and we'll have Officer McGee and his representative come back forward.
All right, so at this point in time, we're moving to what we consider to be executive session. And for both of y'all's edification, we most likely will discuss this amongst ourselves unless there's some question that comes up. We won't direct any questions to y'all, but we certainly reserve the right to do that. We'll seek input from the General Counsel's Office and the Police Academy for their input as it relates to the facts surrounding this. So actually, at this point in time, I would like to go to the firing range and the Police Academy for their input. So we'll start with Sergeant Fillingham.
Okay, so I'd like to talk with Sergeant Fillingham for a second. Sergeant, we've heard what Officer McGee and Officer Hurley testified to as far as their training when it comes to deadly force. I'd like to hear from you as the range master. The decision to use deadly force on a suspect who has a handcuff on one wrist and obviously this blunt other link in his hand or access to it, along with a taser that may or may not have a cartridge. In a situation like that, is deadly force appropriate?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any other questions for the range. I'll have a question for the academy.
No questions.
Any other range questions? Okay.
Okay, and so moving now to the training academy for really non-firearm questioning. Officer McGee testified to his additional training when it came to defensive tactics, also mentioning that he'd had martial arts training as well. Yet a number of blows or a number of strikes were delivered to the suspect. Through defensive tactics training, is it ever explained that there are times when a suspect, you could be delivering the proper strikes, you could be doing the right things as you're trained to do them, yet they have no effect on the suspect?
Yes, it can, based on the suspect's toxicology and mindset at the time.
And so we know that the suspect not only had alcohol in the system, but cocaine as well. And so all of the maneuvers, all of the techniques could have been used properly, but it is certainly within expectations that the suspect just may not actually be responding to those, or they may not be effective on the suspect. And it's not necessarily commentary on whether or not the officers were delivering them correctly or incorrectly.
That's correct.
Okay. I have nothing further for the academy.
No.
Nothing further.
Hit the general counsel's office. Mr. Granite, any input?
I see no legal issues.
You know, based on like Scrubber said, his mindset and his toxicology and the level of resistance he was deploying, I think they worked through a chain of what they could have done. And the FGLE says that the suspect did have their both of their tasers in his hand at some point in time, or touched them at some point in time. I don't think at this point in time we had any decision but to do what needed to be done.
So we obviously know from the report from FDLE that he had contacted the taser or tasers. We know from finding the suspect the way we did when we responded that he certainly had the handcuff on his wrist. And so with those two weapons, I mean, either one of them could be considered a significant risk to an officer that could place him or her in significant risk of significant bodily injury or death. And so either one of those alone, under the right circumstances, could certainly justify the use of deadly force. But with both of the existing, it just heightened, obviously, the risk to the officers.
And, you know, and the fact that, and I alluded to it earlier, was the propensity towards the victim in this case, enough to get that injunction, and then over this last, you know, however many hours, he had shown that, and by your victim's own testimony by way of her 911 call, you know, he's in the mindset to hurt somebody, and you got McGee's testimony saying that he's talking about, you're going to have to kill me. And,
Yep, so we have the violent history, we have the violent incident that occurred hours before, and then we have the violence that he's demonstrating while they're trying to take him into custody. Not to mention the declaration that you're going to have to kill me. I think all of that taken into consideration, along with the weapons that the suspect was armed with, certainly justify the use of deadly force.
yeah, this wasn't just a non-violent person that they were dealing with.
You know, I would also point out that the suspect had multiple opportunities to not come back. You know, he came back to the house 3 times, escalating with the victim. He also had multiple opportunities to cooperate with officers, and he even feigned cooperation. And, you know, and I don't know what his intentions were, but he cooperated just long enough for the officers to think he was cooperating before he fought them again and charged after the officers. And, you know, to me, there was certainly some nefarious intent in that, because he had that opportunity to continue the cooperation and chose not to.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was in his hands to find himself under arrest and not continue to fight like he did. So,
One of the things that I wanted to point out was the fact that it was a very short period of time. It was about a minute, and it escalated to that point where he was taking a taser, they were fighting, and they went all the way around the vehicle in a matter of 60 seconds.
somebody who's got weight on you and cocaine and alcohol and the intent to put it on you.
Lieutenant, I think you covered this when you talked to Sergeant Fillingham, but I just wanted to clarify with both the academy staff that what they said they were taught at the academy is accurate. Because I asked them both, are you taught to respond that way when presented with the CEW and with the open handcuff? And they both said yes, but I want to make sure that you guys agree that's what's taught.
Yes, it's in line with what we teach.
And again, so now for y'all's edification, we're, as a group, we vote, and when we vote, we make a recommendation to the sheriff, and it's just that, a recommendation. He has final authority and responsibility to decide the outcome. Once he does, we'll vote, send these summary and the results of our vote to him. He'll make that decision, and you'll be notified back through your chain of command what his decision was. So, and again, just for your knowledge, we're voting on 3 different questions. 1, was the member's use of force within departmental policy? 2, does a member need any additional situational training? And 3, should the case be referred to internal affairs for any further investigation? And each one of us will vote, and you'll hear our votes on that. We'll tally those and send them up. So if there's no further input from anybody, we'll go ahead and vote. And as we vote, I'll start at my far right and work our way through, and I'll be the last to vote. So again, these questions that we're going to ask, the first one is, was a member's use of force within departmental policy?
Yes, it was.
Yes.
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 Yeah, and I as well vote yes. Does the member need any additional situational training?
No, he does not.
No.
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 I as well vote no. And should this case be referred to internal affairs for any further investigation?
No, it should not.
No.
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 I as well vote no. So you've heard what our recommendations will be. That will be forwarded up through the chain to the sheriff, and at his timetable he'll let you know. That being said, do you have any questions or thoughts for the
No,
board?
sir, just thank you for hearing me.
Okay. I will say that both yours and your witness officer's testimony was well thought out, and you prepared yourself for this. That's appreciated, and the fact that you've continued training is certainly what you should do. And it's unfortunate that an incident like this had to result in deadly force. I said it before, it was the suspect's choice to get to that level, and had he chosen compliance and taken himself to jail like he should have for the crimes he committed, he would not be in the situation he's in today. So with that being said, this concludes the response to resistance board.